Subscribe to our channel now so you never miss a heart-stopping mafia romance story filled with danger, destiny, and unexpected love. On the cold edge of a New York evening, when the city hummed with distant sirens and neon lights blurred against rain-slick streets, Ava Collins sat alone on the floor of her tiny apartment, back against the couch, phone balanced in her hand as she scrolled mindlessly through a food delivery app, exhausted from a 12-hour shift at the hospital and too drained to cook or even think, her hair still tied in a messy bun and her scrubs traded for an oversized hoodie that smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, and when hunger finally won, she ordered the cheapest pizza she could find, extra cheese, thin crust, nothing fancy, just something warm to fill the quiet emptiness that had followed her home, never imagining that this small, ordinary choice would collide with a world far darker and far more powerful than her own. The app confirmed the order with a cheerful chime, estimating 10 minutes for delivery, and Ava tossed her phone aside, unaware that the restaurant she'd ordered from was not just a neighborhood joint but a front, a silent node in an underground empire controlled by a man whose name was never spoken aloud, a man whose presence could freeze rooms and rewrite destinies, Alessandro De Luca, the mafia boss who ruled the eastern seaboard's most ruthless network with a calm precision that made even seasoned criminals tremble, a man who had just finished a brutal meeting where betrayal had been quietly punished and loyalty reaffirmed, when his lieutenant informed him of a minor issue, an online order mistakenly routed to the wrong account, flagged by their system because it came from a building near a rival territory, and Alessandro, already tense and alert, decided to handle it himself, not out of kindness but control, because nothing happened in his city without his knowledge, not even a late-night pizza. Back in her apartment, Ava stood to check the window, watching headlights smear into streaks of white and red below, her thoughts drifting to her mother's medical bills, her student loans, the loneliness she refused to admit out loud, when a knock echoed through the hallway, firm and deliberate, far heavier than the casual tap she expected, and her heart jumped as she glanced at the clock. Barely 10 minutes had passed, so she grabbed her wallet and walked to the door, peering through the peephole only to freeze, confusion flooding her senses as she saw a tall man in a tailored black coat standing perfectly still, a pizza box held in one hand, his posture straight, commanding, nothing like a delivery driver, and when she opened the door just a crack, the hallway light spilled across his sharp features, dark eyes steady and assessing, his presence filling the space with an unspoken warning. Delivery, he said calmly, his voice low and controlled, sending a strange shiver through her, and Ava blinked, her mind scrambling to process the mismatch between his expensive shoes and the cardboard box, between the danger that radiated from him and the ridiculousness of the situation. I ordered a pizza, she replied hesitantly, and for the briefest moment, something unreadable flickered in his gaze, curiosity perhaps, or recognition, as if he were memorizing her face without meaning to. Alessandro handed her the box, their fingers brushing accidentally, and the contact sparked something sharp and unexpected in both of them, a jolt that made Ava pull her hand back while he remained perfectly still, watching her like a predator studying unfamiliar territory. Enjoy, he said, then paused, his eyes moving past her into the small apartment, noting the medical textbooks on the table, the second-hand furniture, the quiet resilience in her posture, and for reasons he couldn't immediately explain, he added, "Be careful who you order from," before turning away, leaving Ava standing in the doorway, heart racing, 1,000 questions colliding in her mind as the elevator doors closed on him, and upstairs, alone again, she locked the door and leaned against it, staring down at the pizza box like it was a ticking bomb, unaware that somewhere below, Alessandro De Luca stood in his car for a long moment before driving off, his thoughts not on rivals or power but on the girl with tired eyes and quiet strength, realizing too late that one small delivery had already altered the course of both their lives, setting in motion a dangerous connection neither of them could escape. The next morning arrived with a strange heaviness for Ava Collins, as if the city itself had shifted while she slept, and she woke with the image of the mysterious man burned into her thoughts, his calm voice replaying in her mind as she went through her routine, showering, dressing for another long hospital shift, and trying to convince herself that the entire encounter had been nothing more than an overworked imagination fueled by exhaustion. Yet even as she stepped into the busy streets of Manhattan, the memory clung to her like a shadow, because nothing about that delivery had felt ordinary, not the way he'd stood, not the way he'd looked at her as if he were reading a page she hadn't known was open, and miles away, in a penthouse overlooking the river, Alessandro De Luca stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, hands clasped behind his back, listening to reports from his men while his thoughts drifted back to the small apartment and the woman who had opened the door with surprise and guarded courage in her eyes, a dangerous distraction he told himself he could not afford, because his life was built on precision, discipline, and control, and distractions were weaknesses that got people killed. The hospital buzzed with controlled chaos as Ava threw herself into work, focusing on patients, charting vitals, answering calls, yet every time the automatic doors slid open, her heart jumped irrationally, and during her lunch break, when her coworker teased her about looking distracted, Ava laughed it off, unaware that Alessandro was making his own calculated moves, ordering a discreet background check that returned within hours, confirming she was exactly who she appeared to be. No criminal ties, no hidden affiliations, just a nurse with debts, responsibilities, and a life far removed from his world, and that knowledge unsettled him more than any threat ever had, because it meant she was innocent, untouched by the darkness that followed him everywhere. Fate, however, had little interest in keeping their paths separate, and that evening, as Ava left the hospital later than usual under a bruised purple sky, she sensed she was being watched, the hair on her arms rising as a black car idled across the street, its engine humming softly, and when she crossed the road, the car moved, matching her pace, panic tightening her chest until the door opened and Alessandro stepped out, his presence commanding the sidewalk without effort. "You dropped this," he said evenly, holding out her wallet, which she realized with a start was missing from her bag, confusion overriding fear as she took it, their fingers brushing again, the spark unmistakable this time. "How did you?" She began, but he cut her off gently. "Careless habits can be dangerous," his gaze searching her face, and despite every instinct screaming at her to run, Ava found herself holding his stare, sensing that while he was dangerous, he was not dangerous to her, not in that moment, and Alessandro surprised himself by adding, "You should let me take you home," a statement that sounded more like an order, and after a tense pause, she agreed, rationalizing that refusing him might be worse, and the ride was thick with unspoken tension, the city lights sliding past as Ava stole glances at him, noticing the faint scar near his jaw, the controlled way he held himself, while Alessandro listened to her talk about her day, her patience, her dreams of something quieter, something safe, and with every word, the walls he had built grew thinner, because she spoke without fear or ambition, without wanting anything from him, and when he dropped her off, he didn't follow her inside, didn't push, only said, "If you need anything, you call this number," placing a card in her hand before driving away, leaving Ava staring after him with a heart that refused to slow, and across the city, Alessandro's world continued to turn ruthlessly as a rival family made a move against his territory, forcing him back into blood and strategy, yet even as he issued orders and secured dominance, his thoughts kept circling back to Ava, to the way she'd smiled shyly in the car, to the way she made him feel something dangerously close to peace, while Ava, alone in her apartment again, stared at the card on her table, torn between fear and curiosity, knowing deep down that she had just been pulled into a story far bigger than herself, one where power and vulnerability collided, and where a single pizza order was no longer the most unexpected thing to happen to her life. The days that followed unfolded like a slow-burning storm, quiet on the surface but heavy with tension underneath, and Ava tried to convince herself that Alessandro De Luca was simply an unusual man who had crossed her path by coincidence, yet his card remained on her kitchen table like a silent promise she refused to acknowledge, while across the city Alessandro tightened his grip on his empire, crushing the rival family that had dared test him, his decisions ruthless and efficient, but even as blood was spilled and power reaffirmed, his mind betrayed him by drifting back to the nurse with tired eyes and unexpected courage, the one woman who had looked at him without fear or calculation, and when a failed hit narrowly missed Ava outside her apartment one rainy night, bullets shattering a nearby car window instead, Alessandro's world snapped into sharp focus, rage cold and absolute as he realized she had become collateral in a war she didn't even know existed. Ava stood frozen under the streetlight, rain soaking her hair as men shouted and tires screeched away, her heart pounding so violently she thought she might collapse, and when Alessandro arrived minutes later, summoned by his security feeds and instincts, he found her shaking but unhurt, fury blazing in his eyes as he pulled her into his arms without thinking, shielding her as if she belonged there, and in that moment, Ava felt the truth crash down on her, not in words but in sensation, the undeniable reality that this man lived in danger and carried it with him wherever he went. This wasn't random, was it? She whispered, and Alessandro didn't lie, his jaw tightening as he admitted, no, a single word heavy with consequence, and he insisted she come with him, not to control her but to protect her, taking her to a secure penthouse high above the city where guards stood silently and the air smelled of steel and wealth, and there, surrounded by glass walls and distant sirens, Alessandro finally told her who he was, not with pride but with brutal honesty, revealing the darkness of his world, the power he wielded, and the enemies that came with it, giving her the choice to leave under protection or stay under his watch, and Ava, overwhelmed and terrified, surprised them both by choosing to stay, not because she trusted his world but because she trusted the man who had come running when she was in danger. Days turned into weeks as Ava lived between two realities, continuing her hospital shifts under heavy security while learning the unspoken rules of Alessandro's life, witnessing the respect and fear he commanded, the way men fell silent when he entered a room, yet also seeing the man beneath the legend, the one who drank his coffee black, who watched old movies late at night, who listened when she talked about saving lives instead of taking them, and the contrast both fascinated and frightened her, while Alessandro found himself unraveling in ways he hadn't anticipated, his instincts screaming that she was a weakness, yet his soul whispering that she was the only thing that had ever felt real, and when Ava challenged him, questioning the violence, the cost, the endless cycle of power, he didn't silence her, didn't punish her curiosity, but listened, even when her words cut deep, because for the first time, someone cared not about his empire but about the man who carried it. Their connection deepened in stolen moments, shared dinners, quiet conversations at dawn, tension thick and unspoken, until one night, when another threat loomed and Alessandro prepared to leave for a dangerous meeting, Ava confronted him, fear and frustration spilling over as she begged him not to go, and something inside him broke, his control slipping as he pulled her close and kissed her, the moment charged with everything they had been holding back, desire, fear, hope, and regret colliding in a single breath, and when they finally pulled apart, both knew there was no turning back, that lines had been crossed and destinies intertwined, because loving her meant risking everything, and protecting her meant fighting a war he could no longer keep separate, and as Ava lay awake later that night, listening to the city below, she understood that the simple life she once knew was gone forever, replaced by a dangerous love that promised both destruction and salvation, while somewhere in the shadows, enemies watched and planned, fully aware that the great Alessandro De Luca now had something priceless to lose. The aftermath of that kiss lingered like a secret neither of them knew how to name, and the penthouse seemed charged with an unspoken awareness that everything had shifted, because Ava no longer looked at Alessandro as just a dangerous protector and Alessandro could no longer pretend she was merely someone under his guard, and as dawn broke over the city, painting the skyline in pale gold, reality pressed in with unforgiving weight, reminding him that love was a luxury his world punished without mercy, yet even as he dressed for the meeting he couldn't avoid, he found himself memorizing the curve of Ava's face as she slept, the steady rhythm of her breathing grounding him in a way power never had. The meeting itself was a calculated dance of threats and alliances, held in a private club sealed off from the public, where Alessandro projected the same cold authority he always had, making it clear that any attack on his territory would be answered tenfold, and while his rivals nodded in reluctant respect, he sensed a shift, a curiosity sharpened into hunger, because rumors traveled fast, and whispers had already begun that the untouchable De Luca had grown careless, had allowed a woman into his life, and back at the penthouse, Ava tried to settle into a routine that felt increasingly fragile, spending her days at the hospital and her nights surrounded by guards who treated her with reverence and distance, struggling with guilt over patients she couldn't fully focus on and fear that she was becoming complicit in a world built on violence. Yet when she voiced those fears to Alessandro that evening, expecting anger or dismissal, he surprised her again by listening, his response quiet and heavy as he admitted that he didn't know how to be both the man she needed and the man his world demanded, and that honesty only pulled her closer. Tension outside their fragile bubble intensified as a rival family made a bold move, targeting one of Alessandro's trusted lieutenants, escalating the conflict into open war, and Alessandro responded with ruthless efficiency, tightening security, shifting assets, and ordering retaliations that rippled through the underworld, all while keeping Ava shielded from the worst of it. But danger has a way of slipping through cracks, and one evening, when Ava insisted on walking a short distance alone after a late shift, determined to reclaim a piece of her independence, the city betrayed her, shadows stretching too long, footsteps echoing too close, and before she could react, she was grabbed and forced into a van, panic stealing her breath as the doors slammed shut. While across town, Alessandro felt the loss like a physical blow the moment his phone rang, rage turning his blood to ice as he realized the unthinkable had happened. The hours that followed were brutal and relentless, Alessandro abandoning diplomacy and restraint as he tore through the city's underbelly, interrogating contacts, tracking signals, leaving fear in his wake, because there were no rules anymore, no negotiations when Ava was involved, and when he finally located the warehouse where she was being held, he moved with lethal precision, his men securing the perimeter as he went inside alone, finding Ava shaken but defiant, her courage burning even through fear, and the reunion was raw and wordless, Alessandro pulling her into his arms as if letting go would mean losing her again, and in the aftermath, as they returned to the penthouse under heavy guard, the cost of their connection became painfully clear, because enemies had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and Alessandro knew there would be consequences that echoed far beyond this night. In the quiet hours that followed, Ava confronted the truth she could no longer ignore, that staying with Alessandro meant accepting constant danger, that loving him meant living with fear, and she wrestled with whether love could justify that cost, while Alessandro, watching her struggle, made a decision that terrified him more than any rival ever had, because for the first time in his life, he considered stepping away from power, from the throne he had built in blood, for the chance at something fragile and real. Yet as morning broke again over the city, messages poured in demanding his presence, his leadership, his violence, and he realized that the choice would not be simple, because the world he ruled would not let him walk away without a fight, and the woman he loved might be the very reason he would finally risk everything. The days after Ava's abduction attempt were marked by a tense, fragile calm, the kind that felt like the pause before a storm, and although the city continued its relentless rhythm outside the penthouse windows, inside everything revolved around unspoken fear and unresolved choices, because Ava could no longer pretend she was just passing through Alessandro's world, and Alessandro could no longer deny that his power, once a shield, had become a magnet for danger that followed her everywhere. Ava tried to return to normalcy, throwing herself into work at the hospital, grounding herself in routines that reminded her who she was before pizza orders and penthouses and armed guards, but even there she felt the weight of invisible eyes and the constant awareness that her life was no longer entirely her own, while Alessandro, haunted by how close he had come to losing her, tightened security to an almost suffocating degree, his men shadowing her movements with military precision, and when Ava finally confronted him about it, frustration and fear spilling out in equal measure, Alessandro listened in silence before admitting that every instinct he had screamed to protect what was his, and the word his hung heavy between them, both a confession and a warning. Their relationship deepened in quieter ways during that uneasy time, built not on grand gestures but on shared vulnerability, on late-night conversations where Alessandro spoke of a childhood shaped by loyalty and loss, of a legacy he had inherited before he was ready, and Ava spoke of dreams she had once had of a simple life, a small home, a future measured in healing rather than harm, and those conversations carved something new into Alessandro's soul, a longing for redemption he had never allowed himself to feel, yet the world outside refused to slow, and intelligence soon reached him that the rival family responsible for Ava's kidnapping attempt was planning something bigger, something final, a move that would either break Alessandro's empire or ignite a war that would consume them all. The pressure mounted as Alessandro faced impossible decisions, torn between eliminating the threat once and for all and the fear that escalating violence would only draw Ava deeper into the crossfire, and when Ava learned the truth, not through whispered rumors but through Alessandro's own reluctant honesty, she surprised him by refusing to be hidden away, insisting that decisions made for her safety without her voice only stripped her of the very strength he claimed to admire, and that courage forced Alessandro to see her not as a liability but as a partner in a way he had never considered possible. Fate, however, had its own cruel timing, and the rival family struck first, orchestrating an attack on one of Alessandro's legitimate businesses during peak hours, a calculated move designed to draw him out and expose his weakness, and as chaos erupted, Alessandro was forced to respond publicly, asserting his dominance while privately ensuring Ava was secured in a safe location far from the violence, but the distance only amplified the fear between them, every unanswered call tightening Ava's chest and every report of casualties hardening Alessandro's resolve, until at last, After a decisive confrontation that ended with his rivals dismantled and their leadership arrested or eliminated, Alessandro returned to Ava, bloodied but alive, the weight of his actions etched into his expression. The reunion was not triumphant but solemn, because victory had come at a cost neither of them could ignore, and in the quiet that followed, Alessandro confessed that the war had clarified something for him, that power no longer satisfied him the way it once had, that every threat against Ava had made him question the empire he had built, and for the first time, he spoke aloud the possibility of stepping back, of dismantling pieces of his operation, of finding a way out that would leave others to carry the burden he no longer wanted, and Ava listened with a mixture of hope and fear, knowing that such a choice would make him vulnerable in ways he had never been before. Their fragile hope was tested when Alessandro's closest confidant warned him that stepping away would invite betrayal, that loyalty in his world was bound to strength and fear, not love, and that those who sensed weakness would move to claim what he abandoned. And as Alessandro wrestled with that reality, Ava faced her own crossroads, realizing that loving him might mean walking through darkness with him rather than waiting safely on the other side, and in a moment of quiet resolve, she told him she would not ask him to give up everything for her, but she would not disappear either, that whatever path he chose, she would face it with open eyes, and that choice, offered freely, shattered something hardened inside him. As night fell and the city lights flickered below, Alessandro held Ava close, knowing that the hardest battle ahead would not be fought with guns or strategy but with the courage to redefine who he was and what kind of future he dared to claim, while unseen forces watched and waited, aware that the king of their world was standing at the edge of transformation, and that whatever choice he made next would change everything forever. The shift that followed Alessandro's quiet confession felt irreversible, like the moment just before a tide changes direction, and both of them sensed that the future was narrowing into a single, dangerous path, because the rumors had already begun spreading through the city's hidden corridors of power that Alessandro De Luca was losing his edge, that love had softened him, and in his world perception was as lethal as truth, while Ava, acutely aware of the danger her presence represented, struggled with the guilt of knowing she was both his strength and his greatest vulnerability, yet refused to retreat into fear, choosing instead to stand beside him with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Alessandro moved carefully in those days, delegating authority, restructuring alliances, and quietly preparing contingencies that would allow parts of his empire to survive without him, knowing full well that every step toward withdrawal increased the likelihood of betrayal, and his instincts proved right when whispers of a coup reached him, subtle at first, then unmistakable, pointing toward men he had trusted for years who now saw an opportunity to seize power. And as Alessandro weighed his options, the old part of him urged decisive violence, swift and merciless, while the man Ava had come to know hesitated, calculating not just survival but consequence. The tension reached a breaking point one evening when Ava overheard fragments of a conversation between Alessandro and his lieutenant. Realizing the coup was imminent and that Alessandro planned to face it head-on without involving her, and anger flared through her fear as she confronted him, demanding honesty instead of protection, reminding him that shielding her from the truth only widened the distance between them, and her words struck deeper than any threat, forcing Alessandro to admit that he was terrified, not of losing power, but of losing her, a fear that left him exposed in a way he had never allowed before. The coup came swiftly and violently, a coordinated attempt to assassinate Alessandro during a routine transfer, and the city erupted into chaos as loyalties fractured and old debts were called in. But Alessandro had anticipated the move, turning the trap back on its architects with calculated precision, securing evidence, isolating traitors, and dismantling the threat without the bloodbath many had expected, a strategic victory that preserved his authority while signaling a shift in how he ruled. And when it was over, he returned to Ava not as a conqueror but as a man exhausted by the weight of the life he was trying to leave behind. In the aftermath, Alessandro made a choice that shocked his world, announcing a gradual withdrawal from direct control, placing trusted intermediaries in charge, and redirecting resources toward legitimate ventures, a move that destabilized the underworld but offered a fragile path toward a different future. And while many saw it as weakness, others recognized it as evolution, a dangerous but calculated gamble that only someone with his power could attempt. And through it all, Ava remained his anchor, supporting him through sleepless nights and moments of doubt, reminding him of the life he was fighting for rather than the one he was abandoning. Yet even as they carved out space for hope, the consequences of Alessandro's past refused to stay buried, and one final threat emerged from the shadows, not from ambition but from vengeance. A lone survivor of a family Alessandro had destroyed long ago, determined to make him suffer by taking the one thing he valued most, and the realization hit them both with chilling clarity that no amount of withdrawal could erase the scars he had left behind, that some debts could only be paid in pain. The threat escalated quickly, forcing Alessandro to make an impossible decision, to draw the danger back toward himself or risk Ava becoming its target, and in a moment that defined them both, Ava refused to run, insisting that living in fear was no life at all, that if they were to face the consequences of his past, they would face them together, and her resolve strengthened Alessandro in ways he hadn't known he needed, giving him the clarity to confront the threat directly, not with the brute force of his former self but with strategy, restraint, and an understanding of what he was truly fighting for. The confrontation was brief but intense, ending with the threat neutralized and the truth laid bare, and as dawn broke over the city once more, Alessandro and Ava stood together at the edge of a future that was no longer defined solely by violence or power, but by the fragile, hard-won possibility of change, knowing that the final step still lay ahead, that the hardest part would be living with what had been done and choosing every day to move forward. And as they watched the city awaken below, both understood that the next chapter would demand more courage than any war, because it would require them to believe that even in a world shaped by darkness, love could still rewrite the ending. The city felt different on the morning everything finally settled, not quieter or safer, but honest, as if the layers of lies and fear that had defined Alessandro De Luca's world were slowly peeling away, and standing beside Ava on the penthouse balcony, watching sunlight spill across the skyline, he understood with a clarity that surprised him that power had never been about control, it had been about survival, and now for the first time survival meant building something rather than destroying it. The transition was neither quick nor clean, because empires do not dissolve politely, and even as Alessandro stepped back from the shadows, remnants of his former life tugged at him through legal battles, broken alliances, and men who struggled to adapt to a world where fear was no longer the primary currency. Yet he faced it all with a steadiness Ava had helped him discover, choosing transparency where secrecy once ruled, restraint where violence had once been instinct, and while some doors closed forever, others opened cautiously, offering opportunities that felt fragile but real. Ava, too, was changed by the journey, no longer just the nurse who had ordered pizza on a lonely night, but a woman who had faced danger, choice, and love head-on, and she returned fully to her work with a renewed sense of purpose, channeling everything she had endured into compassion for her patients, finding strength in the simple acts of healing that grounded her, while learning to accept that her life would never again be entirely ordinary, because loving Alessandro meant living with echoes of his past. Even as they built something new, their relationship matured away from crisis and adrenaline, shaped instead by quiet mornings, shared meals, and honest conversations about fear, guilt, and hope. And though the scars of what they had survived remained, they no longer defined them, serving instead as reminders of how far they had come and what they had chosen to protect. And when doubts crept in, as they inevitably did, Alessandro found himself returning not to old habits but to Ava's steady presence, to the way she reminded him that redemption was not a single act but a series of choices made every day. The underworld adjusted slowly, learning that the legend of Alessandro De Luca had not vanished but evolved, that the man who once ruled through fear now wielded influence through strategy and legitimacy, and while some enemies never forgave him, many learned to coexist with the new order, recognizing that challenging him no longer promised the chaos it once had, and that quiet shift marked a victory no headline would ever capture. Time passed, marked by seasons rather than sirens, and one evening, in the same city that had once felt like a battlefield, Alessandro took Ava back to the modest neighborhood where it had all begun, to the street where she had lived when a simple pizza order had changed everything, and there, away from guards and power, he spoke not as a boss or a king but as a man, acknowledging the harm he had caused, the life he was still learning to live, and the future he wanted to build with her, offering commitment not as protection but as partnership. And Ava, moved not by grand promises but by the honesty of the moment, chose him again, fully aware of the past and hopeful for what lay ahead. Their life together was not perfect or free from shadows, but it was intentional, grounded in trust and resilience, and as they navigated the balance between who they had been and who they were becoming, they discovered that love did not erase darkness, it simply taught them how to live with light alongside it, and years later, when the story of Alessandro De Luca was told in fragments and rumors, few would ever know that his greatest transformation had begun not with a war or a deal, but with a knock on a door and a cardboard box held out in silence. Standing together as the city lights came on one by one, Ava and Alessandro understood that fate had not changed their lives in an instant, it had invited them to choose differently, again and again, and in doing so, they had rewritten the ending they were once certain they did not deserve, proving that even in the most unlikely circumstances, a single choice, a single moment, could lead to a love strong enough to outlast the past and brave enough to shape the future.